I'm Denis King. Welcome back to Key Changes, a musical memoir, episode 6. How do you know when it's time to stop being Britain's teenage pop sensation? Well, reaching the age of 31 certainly helps, believe me. It also helps to know that you want to write music, not just perform it, which leads me to a story about a horse. But first, I want to go back to the King brothers' final days of glory, and I use that word in its very loosest sense, culminating in the giddy heights of a Tupperware convention, followed by the joys of the Playboy Club, playing to 6 bunnies and an oil shake.
To appear at the Albert Hall in front of an audience of 5,000 screaming women might well be a normal, everyday occurrence for the likes of Rod Stewart or Robbie Williams, but for us it was a first. Regrettably, however, the audience response was not due to a sudden attack of King brother fever sweeping the country. It was, I hesitate to say this, a Tupperware convention. I haven't the faintest idea why our act was chosen or what our connection with plastic storage boxes might have been, but we didn't question it. It was, after all, a job. We performed at approximately 10:30 in the morning, just after the delegates had had their coffee and biscuits, and just before the winning sales ladies, accompanied by a renewed surge of mass hysteria, were presented with their awards. We sang There's No Business Like Show Business, High Society, and one with which you may be less familiar, the Tupperware Brigade. Some weeks earlier, the organisers of the event had approached me to write an original song, a sort of Tupperware anthem, celebrating their 5th Distributors' Conference, a recording of which would be handed out to the 5,000 Tupperware conventionees as a souvenir of the day. Thus inspired, I came up with a tune to which writer-friend John Junkin set a similarly inspiring lyric. The King brothers, along with drummer Martin Aston, recorded it on the Tupperware label, I kid you not, once again at the Abbey Road studios. It had been our first time back there since Parlophone had cancelled our contract 5 years earlier. The recording went swimmingly. Afterwards, a musician friend from another session was in the process of putting his gear into the boot of his car when he witnessed the following exchange on the front steps of the studios. As my brother Tony was coming out, carrying his double bass, he was stopped by a young man with a guitar case bounding up the steps coming in. The young man stopped. "Tony, hi, how are you?" he said with a big smile. Tony returned the smile, but with some hesitation. Fine, thanks." "You don't remember me, do you?" the young man said. Yes, you look familiar," Tony admitted, clearly trying to place him. "Have we met?" "We came to see you at the Liverpool Empire, you and your brothers, about 5 or 6 years ago. We got your autographs, and you came to party with us after the show on the Saturday night." Tony still looked puzzled. "It's Paul McCartney." "Oh, yes," said Tony after a beat. "Yes, that's right. Well, nice to see you." "What are you doing here, then?" McCartney asked. At this point, Tony's face lit up. "We've just recorded the Tupperware Brigade," he said rather proudly. "What about you?" "We're making a new album," said McCartney. "Oh, well done," Tony nodded politely. "What's it called?" "Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band." Tony nodded politely again. "Well, good luck with it. Nice to see you," he added, and continued down the steps, bass on his back, to the car. I should explain, this was 1967. The Beatles were everywhere. The music of John, Paul, George and Ringo had taken over the world. Despite my dad being incensed by their very existence, and when seeing them on TV would refer to them as those bloody long-haired bastards, their 4 famous faces were, without question, the most recognisable on earth. Except, of course, to Tony King, who, I should explain, lest you think Mike and I was saddled with a half-wit for a brother, had a rather endearing tendency at times to reside on another planet, to the extent that neither Mike nor I were remotely surprised by the McCartney story. Unlike With a Little Help from My Friends, or indeed any of the tracks on the Sgt. Pepper album, the Tupperware Brigade has not to my knowledge been recorded by any other artists, but surely deserves its own place in popular music history. I would like to suggest that that place be in a time capsule buried under the Albert Hall, carefully preserved in a 1-litre Tupperware space-saver bowl, but I'll let you be the judge.
We're giving a party soon and you can come for free. So come along and see, we're sure that you'll agree. Tupperware, 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 Tupperware is the finest kitchenware that was ever made. Tupperware, 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 Tupperware. Fall in and join the Tupperware Brigade.
Then repeat the chorus until the whole world is singing.
Tupperware, 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 Tupperware is the finest kitchenware that was ever made. Tupperware, Tupperware.
There must surely come a point in everyone's life where one looks around and says to oneself, what am I doing here? And in my case, this moment occurred when opening a piano lid in a leaky barn in a remote field somewhere outside Clonmel in Southern Ireland to see if I could discover why some of the notes were sticking. Imagine one of those magician's cylinders out of which an enormous bouquet of flowers explodes. Piano wires sprung out at me, pinging in all directions. This piano, looking not unlike it had been previously bounced down a flight of steps by Laurel and Hardy, was the instrument I was expected to play an hour later. The King brothers were halfway through a 10-day tour of one-night stands put together by a shadowy Irish promoter named Seamus Bohan, who, needless to say, was nowhere to be seen. Nor, sadly, was an audience. Up until about 15 minutes before the curtain, if you can call it that, there had been no signs of life in or around the barn other than us, a drunken caretaker stage manager and his cat. We were convinced we'd got the day wrong, or perhaps we're in the wrong barn. Then suddenly, swarming towards us over the hill like a scene from the film Zulu, came our audience, in cars, trucks, bikes, old carts and the odd horse. Within seconds, the barn was packed to capacity. We performed as best we could, me on the broken-down upright, which continued to disintegrate throughout the act. Surprisingly, the audience appeared to have a good time. Maybe they didn't get out much. Our big finish was to be our former hit, Standing on the Corner. People always expected it. We'd decided earlier, roughly about the time I ducked to avoid being decapitated by a rogue zinging piano wire, that as a safeguard we would mime to our recording of the song. We gave our 45 RPM record to the caretaker stage manager and instructed him to play it at the appropriate time over the sound system. Miraculously, he did. On it came, right on cue, loud and clear, but unfortunately at the frenetic speed of 78 RPM, not 45.
Standing on the corner, watching all the girls go by. Standing on the corner, watching all the girls go by.
And so, much to the audience's bafflement, Standing on the Corner was performed start to finish by Alvin and the Chipmunks.
Watching all the girls, watching all the girls, watching all the girls go by.
The question, what am I doing here, was by now something I was asking myself approximately every 7 seconds. And after discovering that not only had Seamus Bohan bounced our paycheck, but bounced the one to the Gresham Hotel Dublin as well, leaving us to pay for our 10-day stay or be sued, there was no doubt in my mind by the completion of the tour that the end of the King brothers was nigh. After a joyless, dismal stint at the Playboy Club,
I decided that I'd had enough. I think we all had. An invitation to appear with Sammy Davis Jnr. for his special charity night at the club seemed like a good way to end it, and the prospect of being in a sell-out show with Mr. Show Business bucked our spirits considerably. Well, I thought, at least we'll go out with a bang. Actor friend Julian Holloway, who was there on the night, recently reminded me of Mr. Davis Jr.'s less than glowing introduction to our final appearance. "This show is called Sammy Davis and Friends," he announced to the audience. "Well, this next act are not friends of mine. In fact, I've never heard of them. Ladies and gentlemen, the King brothers." Shortly thereafter, Mike, Tony and I had a meeting, and the matching blazers with the
KBs on the pockets that our mum had lovingly sewn on were consigned to the attic. Not counting the Manchester United Munich air disaster in 1958, the disbanding of the King brothers was genuinely the saddest day of Dad's life, and from then on he wasn't much interested in anything any of us ever did. So that was that. The year was 1970.
6 years earlier,
William Anthony King, Tony, had married a pretty Leslie Roberts Silhouettes dancer he'd met in Blackpool, Candy Scott, and with whom he celebrated his 46th wedding anniversary. They had 3 children and 5 grandchildren. After the act broke up, Tony went to work for a music publisher, then became a plumber, a milkman, an insurance salesman, and then a bank clerk for Lloyd's until he was made redundant. Whereupon, to alleviate boredom, he took up tap dancing, yoga and French lessons while working as a bagger in Safeways.
in retirement, he devoted his time above all to his family, but obviously with intervals set aside for the golf course.
When I began compiling notes for these memoirs, I sent both brothers a list of questions, one of which was, were you happy being a King brother? And to Mike's and my absolute astonishment, because Tony never acted remotely stage-struck, and we'd always thought of him as dependably unexcitable, ambling rather placidly along whatever happened, good or bad, Tony answered without hesitation that he'd loved performing and that the thrill of playing to packed houses was second to none. Quite extraordinary. Mike married actress Carol White, of the groundbreaking TV docudrama Cathy Come Home fame, in 1962 and was in the process of divorce when our act disbanded. He had 2 sons and 1 grandchild and never remarried. Because his handwriting was notoriously indecipherable, he answered my questions verbally into a tape recorder, but not numbered or in any discernible order, the result being I can't find a particular answer when I need it, or indeed even the tape recorder itself now, but I feel safe in saying that performing as a King brother was, for Michael John King, unarguably the high point of his life. He loved the attention, he loved the limelight. I think it's also safe to say that no job since ever fulfilled him in the same way, or indeed in any way. Lying on a bed reading a library book and swimming in the Hampstead Heath Pond seemed to hold the greatest appeal, although over the years Mike managed to work briefly for EMI Records, Thames TV, producer Danny O'Donovan, others who escaped me, and he once founded a short-lived film production company named Tinseltown with actor Robert Powell and Sheikh Abdullah Al Khalifa of Bahrain. Notable experiences included being fired by director Michael Winner in a hotel in New York City for being 1 minute late with a wake-up call, and going on Robert Powell's honeymoon with him to Franco Zeffirelli's villa in Positano when Babs Lord, Robert's lovely new wife, couldn't make it at the last minute due to a Top of the Pops gig with her dance troupe Pan's People. Mike also flew in Piers Adora's private jet and once met Salman Rushdie and Klaus von Bülow in the same evening.
After this long and colourful life, Mike passed away on the 9th of November 2018 of complications due to sepsis. The infection was sudden and unstoppable and paralysed him from the neck down. Eventually, he became unaware of much that was happening around him. Family, friends and fellow swimmers were at his side throughout his 4-month ordeal. 2 days before he died, I was at the hospice in Hampstead and was on my way out of Mike's room when he suddenly spoke. "Taxi!" he whispered. "Get me a taxi!" Startled, I leaned in. Mike hadn't spoken in days. "Taxi?" I said. "What do you want a taxi for, Mike?" There was a pause. Because I'm fucking dying here, he said. His last words to me.
Piers Plowright, broadcaster, writer, poet, year-round swimming friend of Mike's in the Highgate Men's Pond, was inspired by my older brother's final words to me and wrote a marvellous poem in his memory, which, 2 months later, actor Robert Powell read out as we gathered in the dark beside the pond and, quite illegally, but as per Mike's request, surreptitiously scattered some of his ashes in the place he'd grown to love. What you'll hear now is the actual recording of Robert reciting the poem on that winter night on Hampstead Heath, surrounded by a small gathering of the people who loved Mike most.
This is a piece called At Last. Here we go. Don't worry about a meter, Gov. Our cabs are free. Just sit back, enjoy the ride. There's plenty to see either side. See that? That's the Earth, that is. Marvellous, innit? You're free of it now, of course. That's Mars, by the way. No one there at the moment. Heaven's straight ahead. You'll like it there. Being dead is only half the story. Parties you haven't lived, and I know you've seen a few. Yeah, they told me about you. The music, the women, the love of life, the friends, the good and great, and the swimming. There's plenty up above. We love the brothers where you're bound. Got all your records. If you ask me, the sound you three guys made puts this new lot in the shade. Second rate. Anyway, mustn't rabbit on. We're nearly there. And you must be knackered. You'll find the air a tonic, and the grub. Have what you like, and the booze is free. Well, here we are. I'll pull up by this gate. Just follow the arrows, and don't forget to sign the book. No time here, of course, so you won't be late for lunch. Good luck, mate. The angel driver waved goodbye, had a shower, and later, as he ate in the celestial canteen, was heard to say, I had that Mike King in my cab today. That's wonderful, thank you.
As for me, in the summer of 1967, the summer of love, I had become engaged to one, or perhaps it was the other, of the Baker twins, Susan and Jennifer, identical singing, dancing, pretty blondes. I imagine their parents could tell them apart, but to a young man who wasn't and still isn't known for his observational skills, I was never 100% sure who was who. Not that this put me off. I was prepared to make sacrifices where identical singing, dancing, pretty blondes were concerned. Susan Baker, for it was she, and I celebrated our engagement at a party held at a restaurant somewhere in Finchley, North London. Our 4 parents were there, along with, and now I'm trying to think why but can't, Eric Morecambe and his wife Joan, who kindly presented us with a set of stainless steel steak knives with wooden handles as an engagement gift. Susan and I soon began looking at flats and discussing final wedding plans. A few weeks after our engagement celebration, the phone rang at my bachelor flat on the Fulham Road. Hi, it's Sue. Jenny and I have been offered a year's contract at the Tropicana Hotel in Las Vegas starting in December. You won't mind, will you? But we're supposed to be getting married, I cried. I know, but our agent says this is a really terrific career move. The Baker twins flew off to America to do their show, a singing and dancing revue. I flew over to visit a month later in January, my Christmas present from Sue. It was a dreadful journey, the plane delayed by heavy snow in Chicago, and I arrived in Las Vegas 5 hours late, by which time the twins were at rehearsals. They'd left a message with the caretaker at the Bacon and Peg's apartments that I was to be shown up to their flat. I was exhausted. I made a cup of tea and after waiting another hour, knew I had to put my head down before I collapsed. I was awakened by the sound of loud voices, great hilarity and music. The twins were home, plus others. I looked at my watch. It was 3 a.m. Sue seemed surprised and rather annoyed by my beady refusal to join the festivities in the living room. A less than encouraging start to the reunion in the desert with my betrothed. I was due to stay 2 weeks. I left after 1, during which the routine never varied. The girls would sleep until mid-afternoon, at which time they'd head off to rehearsal, followed by 2 performances and get home in the wee hours. I, meanwhile, would arise with the lark, make myself a piece of toast and a cup of tea, and then stroll down the strip. There was nothing else to do. The sun was out, but it was cold, and the pool wasn't filled. I'd spend each day wandering in and out of various big hotels, lured by the sound of great music which emanated seemingly from everywhere. For the price of a beer, you could sit in a lounge and watch everyone from Mel Torme to Vic Damone to the Basie Band. That was, of course, fantastic, but I hardly saw Sue, the main reason I was there. We'd so far only managed to run into one another sporadically, so on her day off, I'd planned a romantic outing. However, I returned from my early morning stroll to find her heading out the door. "Where are you going? I thought we were going to see the Hoover Dam today." "Oh, sorry, we've got a photo call for our new number. Didn't I mention?" I agreed to stay for the twins' 21st birthday, a few days away, then flew back to London, having decided that Susan and I were perhaps not meant for one another after all, even if she were Jennifer. Our engagement was dissolved. I never returned Eric and Joan Morecambe's lovely wooden-handled steak knives and still experience a slight twinge of guilt whenever I cut into a ribeye.
By 1970, I was by now a year into my marriage to Carol Arrell, the young widow of comedian Don Arrell, and who came with a delightful 2-year-old daughter, Fiona. None of us left the act wealthy men, and we all struggled to support our families. The combination of unscrupulous agents, managers and producers who often took advantage of our youth and naivete assured that after 18 years in show business, we 3 brothers had very little to show for it other than memories, a few scrapbooks, a pile of 45s and 2 silver-tipped black dancing canes. I don't know where the other one went. I deeply regret missing out on a formal education, but it was an indisputable privilege to have been around for the era of twice-nightly variety. It was a time when performers had the opportunity to hone their act in front of an audience for 52 weeks a year, to polish jokes or songs or dance routines until they were as good as they could possibly get, where you had a chance to learn your profession and to be professional. It's a luxury that no longer exists. According to Mike, I loved performing, had an incredibly effervescent personality and innocence, and was not remotely shy. Perhaps this is true, I honestly don't know. But what I do know is that by the age of 30, my effervescence had lost quite a bit of its fizz. By then I knew what I wanted to do, and it wasn't performing. Let me tell you a little tale. We once worked in Variety with a comedy dance act called the O'Keefe Brothers and Annette. Years later, after the King brothers had gone their separate ways, Mike and I happened to be killing time together before a meeting at a London TV studio, and were on our way down to the canteen for a cup of tea when a pantomime cow passed us in the corridor. "Hello, boys," an Irish voice called out. We turned. The cow took its head off, and there stood Seamus O'Keefe, grinning broadly. "How you doing, lads?" We greeted one another like old lost friends and tried to remember the various hippodromes and empires in which we'd worked together. "How's Annette?" Mike asked tentatively, fearful she might have passed on by now. "Here I am," cried the rear end of the cow. Annette went on to explain through the spotted furry fabric that since the death of Variety, their cow act had been their bread and butter. They both seemed pretty cheerful about it. "That's just a curtain call." But I knew then and there that whatever direction my life might take, we'd made the right decision in breaking up the act when we did, before the King brothers ended their days in a third-rate touring production of Peter Pan, all three packed tightly into a crocodile suit. "I've seen it all." It's one thing to know what you want to do in life, but quite another to know how to go about it. In the meantime, playing golf, might I just say, is an excellent way to procrastinate, something my first wife was always keen to point out as I'd head up to Finchley Golf Course for the 5th time that week. Of course I knew I should be doing other things, more lucrative things, more responsible things, especially as I now had a wife and child to support, but on I played, feeling guilty, but not quite guilty enough to stop, forever marvelling at how quickly the mind convinces itself that getting one's handicap down will somehow enable one to produce award-winning music for which people will fork over vast sums of money and thereby get the new set of clubs I wanted. It was suggested, rather in the form that an ultimatum is suggested, that if I were truly serious about wanting to write film and television music for a living, then I should perhaps learn how to do it, and that the best place to do this might be at school. Thus, having not set foot inside a classroom since I was 15, Christchurch Secondary School, Southport, it was more with trepidation than excitement that I enrolled at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama in London to study orchestration. I could only afford one term. I suppose I had in mind a sort of crash course in scoring for orchestra. My tutor, an eminent classical composer named Professor Edmund Rubra, thought otherwise. My first homework assignment, and in fact my last, was to get hold of a piano copy of Debussy's La Fille aux Cheveux de Lin, take it home and start scoring it for a full symphony orchestra. I'd never heard of the piece. Professor Rubra had to repeat the name 3 times and play a snatch of it for me on the Bechstein before I finally said it sounded vaguely familiar, something which appeared to please him. On the way home, I bought a copy of the music, several sheets of score paper, 2 new HB pencils, a sharpener, a rubber, the latter of which proved to be particularly useful, and then with a certain amount of dread, because I'd never scored for anything other than piano, bass, guitar and drums, and once for a washboard, made a start. I lived, ate, breathed and erased La Fille aux Cheveux de Lin solidly for the whole week, at the end of which I'd managed to complete only the first 4 bars. Somewhat embarrassed, I took my homework in to Professor Rubra, who peered at it, this didn't take long, and asked why I had arranged the opening phrase for flute. I wasn't sure what he meant. Because I heard it that way, I said. Professor Rubra smiled and shook his head. No. It has to be clarinet. Oh, I said, why is that? Because it always is, he explained. Oh, I said again. I still didn't know what he meant, but he was insistent, and he was the professor, after all, and I was the former King brother from Hornchurch who'd left school at 15 and had a few hit records, not to mention shared dressing rooms with, in no particular order, Jimi Hendrix, Alex the juggling Nazi, and Marquise and his chattering chimps. So when it came to having clarinets or not having clarinets, I accepted that Professor Rubra had the definite edge on me. However, he never gave me a satisfactory explanation as to why it shouldn't be a flute, and I think I was able to score 2 more bars of the piece over the next few weeks before we decided to drop the whole assignment. I completed the term, just. Although I liked the professor, we clearly didn't see eye to eye and probably never would, and I'm not sure what I got out of the course other than being able to put studied at the Guildhall School of Music, London on my CV, which seems to impress people. You just don't mention the one-term part. About 8 years earlier, while still performing as a King brother, I wrote a song for the B-side of one of our records called Got a Feeling. It was the first song I'd ever written, both words and music. To this day, my one and only success as a lyricist. And while it was nothing especially memorable, it went on to be recorded by Doris Day.
Got feeling, got it bad. What a feeling drives me mad.
Which was enough to make me think I might have a future as a songwriter, even though deep down, writing for film and television was what I desperately wanted to do. By the time I'd enrolled at the Guildhall, I'd already had a couple of television sitcom themes accepted, and this was encouraging, even though someone else had orchestrated them, and I felt I could now legitimately call myself a composer. Well, almost. To my way of thinking, a composer, as opposed to a songwriter, should first of all be someone who doesn't just pick out a melody on a keyboard or sing it into a tape recorder. Walter Scharf, Hollywood film composer, had to build the score for Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory based on rather primitive tape recordings created by songwriters Anthony Newley and Leslie Bricusse, and he forever after referred to them, despite their accomplishments, as the Hummers. A composer also ought to have the tools to know what to do with this melody once he's found it, and how to get the very best out of it. And in order to do this, very simply, you need to know how to orchestrate, to be able to hear the sound of each instrument in your head and know how to commit that sound to paper, or these days, computer. The Guildhall patently wasn't the answer for me, so I knew I had somehow to figure it out for myself. Yet again, I was reminded that Finchley Golf Course was not really the answer, and that the first thing a budding television composer required, and I imagine this still holds true, was a job. How you went about finding a job back then was you'd contact a television company and anyone you knew there, remind them you were a former King brother, Britain's youngest rhythm aces, and with that impressive pedigree in mind, ask them to please consider you for any future composing work. Your name went on a list, or in a bin, and you'd wait. If this was the BBC, occasionally a letter would arrive outlining details of a forthcoming show and inviting you to submit a theme tune. You would read the brief, make a cup of coffee, light a cigarette, sit down at the piano, fiddle around for an hour or two, say sod this for a game of darts, and get up, go out and hit a few golf balls. Thus inspired, you would return to the piano, knock out a couple of tunes, record them onto reel-to-reel tape, and send it in along with a piano part on manuscript paper. Usually you'd never hear from them, but if you were lucky, about 3 months later, you get it all returned to you in the post with a note saying, "Sorry, it was not what the producer was looking for." When the show would be transmitted, you'd look for the music credit, and there it would be, sure enough, music by Ronnie Hazelhurst, then head of music at BBC Television. You began to wonder if there was a connection. Be nice to think there wasn't, but the fact remained you had a much better chance of success if you were dealing with ITV companies and got better money. One fine day, I learned from a music publisher friend of a new series about to go into production for London Weekend Television. It was about a horse. Black Beauty, the 1877 novel by Anna Sewell, was being made into a children's adventure television series, and the producers, Paul Knight and Sidney Cole, were in the market for a suitable theme tune. The brief was like any other brief that came my way, and a tune is a tune. You try your best, whatever the project. But The Adventures of Black Beauty, as the series would be called, was already generating a lot of attention. The buzz was out that this one would be big. 16 composers were being invited to submit. Strong outdoor theme a la the Virginian, but not cowboy or American, and not less than 35 seconds was all I had to go on. And with that brief in mind, I sat down at my piano, for once didn't get up, and an hour later had a melody I was more or less happy with. I put it to one side for 24 hours. When I went back to it, I was still happy with it and convinced it was what I wanted. So I tinkered a bit, made some adjustments, recorded it onto quarter-inch tape and sent it off along with a manuscript lead sheet and waited, something that by then I was rather good at. Within the week, Harry Rabinowitz, head of music at London Weekend Television, rang. "Dennis, it's Harry. The producers have chosen 8 out of the 16 submissions, and you're one of them." 4 days later, he rang again. "Dennis, it's Harry. The producers have chosen 4 out of the remaining 8, and you're one of them." A week later, the phone rang again. "Dennis, it's Harry. Congratulations, they've chosen your theme." "That's fantastic, Harry," I cried, looking around for someone to tell besides the dog. "You do realise," Harry said, "that you'll be expected to compose and score all the incidental music as well? There's 52 episodes. That's an awful lot of music. You are capable of this, aren't you, Dennis?" He added, knowing full well how inexperienced I was, but wanting me to succeed. "Yes, of course, Harry," I managed to say, lighting another silk cut to accompany the one I was already smoking. "Of course I could do it. Why, what's 52 episodes of horse music for anyone who could master 4 bars of La Fille au Cheval de Lin? Upwards and onwards. Hi-ho, Silver." The next shock was that the Black Beauty theme had to be recorded the following Saturday, and I had 5 days to orchestrate it. It seems the studio and a 40-piece orchestra plus chorus had been booked for a Tommy Steele special, but Tommy had flu and London Weekend didn't want to waste the recording session. I cancelled a dinner party for my mother-in-law, not perhaps my greatest sacrifice, an evening at the theatre, with far deeper regret pulled out of a golf tournament at Moore Park, and opened a book called Orchestration by Walter Piston, which purports to be a sort of Bible for serious composers, but couldn't make head nor tail of it. It's about now that I started to panic. I mentioned this to a friend of mine, actor, comedian, brilliant musician Dudley Moore, whom I ran into at the chemist's in Hampstead High Street, having nipped out for yet another packet of indigestion tablets, and an hour later there was a knock at my door. There was Dudley, having galloped over to the rescue with a gift for me, a book called Sounds and Scores by Henry Mancini. It saved me. If ever you want to know about orchestration, anything at all, how to do it, what it's all about, what's the range of an oboe or a French horn, what are the 2 longest glisses you can get from a trombone, any normal everyday questions, you should consider investing in this book. It has proved indispensable to me, and even after 40 years, I've had it rebound twice, I still occasionally refer to it. Mancini makes his guide accessible to the novice, easy to understand, and removes a lot of the mystery. Most important, he shows you how to have confidence, as in fact did Dudley, who was always happy to pop round to advise a fledgling orchestrator. Thus armed with Henry M., my pencils and trusty rubber, I got my head down and scored the full theme for The Adventures of Black Beauty, which London Weekend Television would later retitle Galloping Home. I also scored what are known as the opening and closing titles and the in and out of commercials, all for a 40-piece orchestra and chorus, and all was recorded at Wembley Studios in May of 1972, with Harry Rabinowitz conducting the London String Chorale, a make-up name for the record release, and me watching anxiously from the control room with the producers Paul and Sid. It would be another couple of years before I was confident enough to buy a baton and wave my arms about in front of people who frankly can spot a phony a mile off. The recording went well. Harry Rabinowitz congratulated me, so did many of the musicians. Paul Knight was positively euphoric. More importantly, the orchestration seemed to work. Miraculously, I hadn't screwed up. I hadn't given the second violins an F sharp instead of an F. Everyone loved the French horns going broop, broop. It all worked. I'd actually done it. Amazing. I decided I'd never let the Mancini book out of my sight and invited Dudley and his wife for Christmas. Composing the incidental or background music for The Adventures of Black Beauty proved something of an adventure itself. It was a considerably more complicated operation than scoring the theme. I'd never experienced synchronizing music to film, never seen anyone do it, and didn't know how on earth it was done. It was done, at least it was in 1972, I soon discovered, with something called a moviola, a freestanding machine about the size of a large tumble dryer, but looking more like a Heath Robinson combination film projector, cash register and slot machine. The one I first encountered resided in the cutting room at London Weekend Television, and therein lay the bulk of the problem. In a half-hour episode, there would typically be an average of 15 minutes of background music, all of which had to be specially written for each individual episode and tailored to the action on screen. As a general rule, you'd be required to write lyrical music for a pastoral scene, jolly music for a happy one, dramatic for moments of higher drama, and so on, and all connected in this case by what seemed hours and hours of endless, incessant, galloping hooves. Which music went where was discussed and decided by the director, the film editor, and me, and this discussion took place in the cutting room in front of the moviola, on which footage of the episode could be seen on a tiny viewing screen. Imagine 3 heads crammed together all trying to peer at one iPhone, and you'll get the picture. The director of the first episode was Charles Crichton, famous for Ealing comedies and later A Fish Called Wanda, and also famous for smoking his pipe throughout the editing sessions, thus creating an atmosphere akin to London smog in the enclosed quarters of the cutting room. We'd watch the entire episode, or what we could see of it, then watch it again, but this time stopping and starting while the editor and I took notes and critical timings with our stopwatches. When we were all agreed as to what kind of music was required where, I'd go home, but not, unfortunately, with the magnificent moviola machine. I would have just a sheet of paper covered with my hastily scribbled notes and timings to refer to, the idea being that I'd be able to decipher the whole thing once on my own, and that I'd also remember every single frame of a film I'd seen twice at most from a remote angle, and be able to compose appropriate music to fit. From the outset, I spotted the odd gaping hole in this spectacular theory. First of all, within a 3-minute film sequence, there might be 5 or 6 or more dramatic points that needed musical underlining. A door opens and the villain appears. Vicky leaps onto Beauty. Villain brandishes a stick. Beauty rears up. Vicky falls off Beauty, and so on. And, of course, it was vital that the underscore be synchronized to these moments to within a fraction of a second. This is something that nowadays is comparatively easy to accomplish with video, DVDs, computers and click tracks at one's disposal, but not so easy then, with only a stopwatch and a wind-up metronome. Secondly, to expect outstanding results from a memory that has been severely tested a number of times, not always successfully, by the complexities of travel directions, shopping lists, or the arrival of a new colour scheme in the hallway is, well, optimistic to say the least. With my metronome ticking back and forth, I sat at my piano counting bars, counting seconds, trying to make sense of my notes, desperately trying to remember what the hell I'd seen earlier. Was this her getting on the horse or off the horse, or the horse rearing up, or had it already done that, or, Christ, maybe the horse had already bolted? The whole process was torture, and I can say this now, I don't much care for horses anyway, and was certainly sick of them by the end of 52 episodes. Half an hour before the first recording session at Olympic Studios for the incidental music for episode 1, Harry Rabinowitz, who would be conducting the orchestra, met me in the hallway outside the control room to have a quick look at my scores, which I handed over rather reluctantly, then awaited with the same sense of doom I'd experienced outside Father Andrew's study at St. Bonaventure's Grammar School, Forest Gate. Q1 and Q7, Harry said. The stable hands fist fight and the horses over the hedgerows. There's not enough music. How could he know so quickly? But don't worry, Harry gave me a friendly pat and headed for the studio. I'll make it work. And he did. The session started, the film clip for the first cue came up on the big screen, the musicians started playing my music, and Harry, by conducting it slower here and faster there, made it all fit perfectly and sound magnificent to boot. And I was getting all the credit. How marvellous. I liked this composing lark. Composing was fun. Harry Rabinowitz's kindness and, I have to say, genius carried on throughout the recording of the entire series. There is nothing better than practical experience, and being thrown in at the deep end is often the best thing that can happen. But his kindness didn't stop in the studios. After every morning session, we'd retire to his office at London Weekend TV, where he'd take me through the scores, bar by bar, while listening to the audio tape of what we'd just recorded, and he'd show me how to improve things. For instance, I had at one point used a solo flute, the very one that Professor Rubrub wouldn't let me use, under Vicky's dialogue. Harry pointed out that as the flute was in the same register as Vicky's voice, I'd be better off using an instrument with a lower pitch, one that would complement it, such as a cello. Brilliant, I thought. I learned more from Harry Rabinowitz in the average afternoon than if I'd stayed at the Guildhall for the rest of my life. To date, The Adventures of Black Beauty has earned me more in royalties than anything I've ever written. It continues to be transmitted all over the world. The theme has been used for commercials, ringtones, the news, practically any time there's horse racing on television, and, my personal favourite, featured in an episode of the sitcom I'm Alan Partridge as music to party by in a motel room. The music won an Ivor Novello Award for Best TV Theme, and in a national newspaper poll was voted the second most memorable TV theme of all time, just being pipped at the post by my own mother's all-time favourite, Hawaii Five-0. Book 'em, Beauty, Murder One, 3 counts.
In the next episode, success as a composer gives me the chance to work with some of the very best in the business, plus some of the not so best. However, it becomes clear to me that this is my destiny.
And these are the days of wine and roses. That said, there are times when I'd rather have seen a little less wine and a few more roses.
See you then. Key Changes is a Brudenus production.